You might have seen videos where people talk about making people correctly pronounce their name. Maybe something like this.
You should say the proper way to say your name.
I don't settle no more. I make them say it right.
Now, I think these creators are coming from a good place of trying to show appreciation and respect, but they're doing that while misunderstanding some of the fundamental linguistics behind this stuff. Take a look at this video, which is someone trying to get what I think is their Korean dad to pronounce the words coffee and copy.
커피 뒤에가 뭔 커피요? 그건 잘 알지. 커피.
Korean doesn't have that F phoneme that's in the word coffee, so for him, it's very hard to ever pronounce that. And research shows us that if you don't have certain sounds in your native language or even just your native accent, not only is it difficult, arguably impossible for you to ever actually pronounce that sound that's not in your language, but it might be impossible for you to even hear them. Starting as young as 6 months old, you start losing the ability to tell apart sounds that aren't in your native language.
I have friends who have like indigenous names, and they talk about all the time how they grew up and they were like, oh yeah, people would come up with these nicknames for me, and I just wish people would say my actual name.
He mentions indigenous names, and that video had hashtag Mexican, so I'm assuming these creators are Mexican or Mexican American. When I googled Aztec names, this is the first result. Do you see how some of these names might be challenging for English speakers? All of these names have at least one sound that doesn't even exist in English or in Spanish. So most Mexicans aren't pronouncing these names the way they'd be pronounced in their original language either. That language in English we call Nahuatl. In the language itself, it's pronounced more like Nahuatl. I don't speak the language myself, so please forgive my pronunciation. If you speak the language, please let us know how you say it. But that last sound is a very rare sound in world languages. Most people have never heard of it and don't even know it exists. So unless you speak a language with that sound, you're probably not really saying it that accurately.
They're able to pronounce like a lot of like European sounding names, but as soon as they see like some form of ethnic name, I feel like everything in their head just goes out the window.
So there's two parts to this I want to mention. First, what do you mean by an ethnic name? A lot of people say ethnic to refer to anything that's kind of not WASP or non-white American. Personally, I don't really like that terminology because everything is ethnic to somebody. Even within white people, there are many different ethnicities and cultures and histories. And something that you might call ethnic is just normal in the culture where it's from. For example, I have an Indian friend whose name is Raghav. In India, is his name ethnic or is it just a regular Indian name? Every culture is part of someone's ethnicity. Everything is ethnic from some perspective. And what do you mean by European sounding names? Do Mexicans with Spanish names not also have European sounding names? Are Spanish names not European sounding? And people do mispronounce European names all the time. For example, this was my master's thesis supervisor's name. It seems pretty obvious, right? Jacobs, a name that a lot of Americans probably have. But he's Dutch. He doesn't pronounce it Jacobs. His name is Dr. Jacobs. Then what about my secondary supervisor? He is Canadian. He always pronounced his name Genen. But he moved to the Netherlands, where his father is from, and he learned that the name is pronounced Genen. That was his own name, his father's name, that he never knew how to pronounce the Dutch way until he lived in the Netherlands as an adult. And this is a pretty common Dutch girl's name. Now, I knew one person with this name in high school in America, an American girl with this name. I don't know if she came from a Dutch family or what, but this was her actual name, and it was mispronounced all the time. In Dutch, this would be pronounced Marijke. And then this is the name of one of my favorite composers. You've probably heard her music in a lot of TV shows and movies that you might have watched. In 2020, she won the Golden Globe for Best Original Film Score. This is a clip of Jennifer Lopez announcing her as the winner of the award and getting her name wrong.
And the Golden Globe goes to Hildur for the Joker. Yes.
By the way, that was the second time that night that they got her name wrong.
My name is Hildur Guðnadóttir and I am a composer and musician.
And I made a video on TikTok in response to a similar video from this Latina creator.
If they can say Schwarzenegger, they can say Abiaser.
That's a good point, except we're not pronouncing Schwarzenegger correctly. This is how the man himself says it.
Actually, in Austria, they pronounce it Schwarzenegger.
And they assume, and we all assume, that these other European names are correct, but in reality, we just don't actually know how they're actually supposed to be pronounced. So the way we pronounce them in American English-speaking society is what we think is normal. And then a commenter from this video said that if they can pronounce the names in Game of Thrones, they can pronounce yours. Yes, Game of Thrones does have a lot of unusual and strangely spelled names. But keep in mind, it is a complete fiction written by an American man. Even in the TV show, when they fully developed these fictional languages, those fictional languages have phonemes that are almost identical to the set of phonemes in English, because they needed to be pronounced by predominantly British and American actors. Even fellow speakers of your same language would not pronounce your name the same way you do. For example, my first name is Carson. A British person would not pronounce it that way, but would I badger him for not pronouncing the R? Or Charles, the name of the King of England, where the language comes from. He doesn't pronounce his name Charles, but would you correct me for not pronouncing his name correctly? Or what about my mother's name? If you speak Spanish, you might think, oh, that's obviously Ramonita. I'm not going to pronounce it the anglicized American way. But my mom doesn't pronounce her name that way, even if she's speaking Spanish. She's Puerto Rican. Her accent is from Aguada on the west coast. They don't have that r phoneme in their accent, so she pronounces her name Ramonita. Now you might be saying what's important is that people try. It's when people don't even try that really bothers me. But when people are saying things like this,
I don't settle no more. I make
Yeah.
them say it right.
Make sure you make people pronounce that shit.
Yeah, tell them, you
Tell
know.
them and correct them so they say it
Yes.
right.
when people hear that and they see a name that they know they're not going to be able to pronounce, maybe they're a little embarrassed. Maybe they're afraid to say it, knowing they'll get it wrong, possibly be called disrespectful, and be made to say the name over and over again, knowing that they won't be able to get it right. I spent a year learning Dutch, living in the Netherlands, doing my master's degree in linguistics in the Netherlands, and I still can't say the word rechts. It's very hard. I might get close sometimes, rechts, but it's really hard for me to do that. That's just the Dutch word for right. As we saw with the Korean man at the beginning of the video, these things are not easy. They might be way harder for the person trying to say the name than you might be realizing. They might not know what they're doing wrong. If you just repeat the word or your name to them over and over, they can't necessarily hear what they're getting wrong. You would have to actually break down the phonetics of it to try and explain it to them, to teach them how to produce sounds that they've never produced before. And most people just don't have that kind of knowledge. Not a lot of people study or know that much about linguistics. And that's totally fine to not know things. That's why I make these videos, to try to share that information. I didn't know anything about linguistics before I started studying it. That's why I love it, because it's a wealth of new information. I'm really learning new stuff every day. When people don't or can't pronounce a name, it is very rarely out of bad intentions. Yes, sometimes you get people who are intentionally being disrespectful. They're racist, xenophobic, whatever the case may be. But in many cases, for example, an American English speaker mispronouncing a Spanish language name, when you complain that they're not pronouncing that name correctly, you're essentially complaining that they're speaking the way they naturally speak in their American English accent and not morphing their accent to a Spanish one to pronounce that name. Do you see how that might make somebody self-conscious when they get complaints that they're speaking the way they naturally do? And I'm not saying you should just accept the way anybody says your name. It's your name, it's special and important to you. You should stand up for it. You should try to make sure it's appreciated. But if they're getting your name wrong, it's because it's hard for them. You have to go about it with compassion and patience. It's okay for you to try to get people to pronounce your name and for people to never be able to pronounce your name correctly. It's okay for both of those things to exist at the same time. And try to think about it in the reverse sometimes. For example, my first name is Carson. There are several phonemic things going on here that do not exist in Spanish, and I live in Colombia. Nobody that I've met has ever pronounced my name correctly. In fact, on multiple occasions, I have introduced myself and people don't even ask me to repeat it, don't even try to say it. They just give me a pen and paper and tell me to write it down. How would you feel about a gringo in Colombia going around trying to make people repeat his name over and over until they got it right and pronounce it the way an American English speaker would? Would you genuinely have the same reaction and feel the same way as when you see an American English speaker mispronouncing a Spanish name? It's hard to speak any way other than your natural accent. I mean, just think about how hard it is for people to do different accents in their native language, let alone ever sounding like a native speaker in a foreign language. Names are words like any other. Yes, they are important to you, but to other people, you can't make them feel like it's more important. A name might just be one of thousands of words somebody says every day. People are not going to get everything right, and it's absolutely okay for you to try to get them to say your name correctly, but it's just not always going to happen, and expecting it to is the problem. So I hope I've done a good job explaining this. This is my first linguistics video that I made specifically for YouTube. If you enjoyed this, you can check out my TikTok at WoodyLing, where I've got hundreds of more videos about all kinds of things about linguistics. And please let me know how I did in this video. If you liked it, please give it a like and maybe subscribe. Follow me on TikTok. Tell me how I can improve. If you like the way I step to the side and put the videos and pictures over here, how's my audio quality, my video quality, anything that I did, anything that I can improve or that you thought was really good, please let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and remember, every accent, every dialect, every language, the way everybody speaks around the world are all equally valid and beautiful. Goodbye.